Hello, everyone. I guess for most of you, it's probably late evening, it would be my guess, or afternoon, late afternoon, like me. Maybe for some unlucky folks in your midst, it may be early morning, and then I really apologize about that. I do know that I'm the last talk in the conference. I can't see how many people are online at the moment. Clearly, they'll also this thing will also be on the video, so it doesn't matter that much, but. For those of you that are hanging around, I'm kind of glad to have you, of course, because this is sort of a die-hard type talk. And I'll talk a little bit about, as I always do, I'll give a little bit of an anecdote, a little bit of a story about what this talk is about and why am I bothering giving it. The other thing I'll tell you is, this is one of those talks that I've given. This is, first of all, a 15-year-old talk. Just so you know. But in those 15 years, I've really had very few opportunities to deliver it. The few opportunities that I've had to deliver this talk live, I've tried to keep it interactive. Online, it's a little bit weird. That's not so possible. But I'd like to keep at least the spirit alive in keeping this talk as interactive as I can. So in the spirit, what I ask is, get your brain going. There's a lot to think about in this talk. And when you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear those questions and comments. So please go ahead and post them real time. Don't bother waiting until the very end. There's no reason for that. And if we don't cover the entire material, I think it's actually fine. Because most of the key material I'll be covering towards the beginning of the talk anyway, so it doesn't actually matter that much. So I very much encourage you to share your thoughts and share your questions, and I will sort of periodically check what's going on, and I'll stop and answer those questions. Okay, so let's get to story time. What is this talk about? Why am I bothering doing it? This talk actually is very special to me. In fact, I'd say, this is a very personal talk. And this is one of the reasons why, when I always present this talk, I think about, okay, should I be presenting this talk as my day job role, which is, principal program manager for Java on Azure, and I try to obviously try to enable the entire Jakarta EE ecosystem within Azure as best as I can, or do I deliver this talk as a person? And I always land on this is a personal talk. This is a talk that I'm giving as myself, and to some extent on behalf of the Jakarta EE ambassadors. And I'll talk a little bit later what the connection is between this particular talk and the Jakarta EE ambassadors, and I think it's a relatively deep connection. So thank you for the conference for accepting this talk. As I said, I've submitted this talk for 15 years and only a few conferences, even want to bother accepting it. So thank you for that very much. I very much enjoyed this talk, and this is a meaningful talk for me. So what is this talk really about? So this is not a talk where I'm going to be talking to you about, hey, what the latest Jakarta EE technology standards are, what the latest changes are, what the APIs are, and how we can contribute, so on. It's not that type of talk at all. It's actually a talk about the foundational values of why you would care about something like Jakarta EE in the first place. And it's about building that, if you will, the foundation upon which you build your building and furnish your house or what have you. But it's that basic fundamental, much more fundamental thing that you have to ground yourself on before you actually commit yourself or that you care about this particular technology. Another reason why this talk is a little bit personal is other than the open standards and the Jakarta EE part, the Freakonomic part. Now, a little bit about me. I didn't start my career path in technology per se. I sort of stumbled into technology and ultimately took a technology-centric path. Really, where my career started was economics. In fact, one of my sort of childhood dreams, teenage dreams, was I was going to work for as an economist for either the World Bank or the ADP, the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. Sort of helping developing nations, build the foundations of their own economies. So this is one of the very few places I actually get to talk about sort of that part of my career journey and that part of my thinking and that part of my educational foundation. Because this is ultimately, believe it or not, a lot of which drives even my work today, and certainly drives my my enthusiasm, passion, whatever you want to call it, into this technology called Jakarta EE. So let's dive into it. I told you a little bit about what the motivation is. Basically, the motivation is I'm trying to explain to you why I care about this technology and why I've been involved with it for such a long time. And I'm going to explain this to you from a part of my background, which is economics, not technology at all. So actually, this would be perfectly fine as probably a university economics course lecture. But here I am trying to give this talk to you. So we'll see how it goes. So first thing you need to understand is what exactly is Freakonomics. So I don't know how many of you actually know what Freakonomics already is. If you happen to know what Freakonomics is, actually this talk will go very differently and will land with you much more differently than if you didn't. Either way, it actually doesn't matter, but it helps to know what Freakonomics is. If you don't, I'm going to explain it to you right now. So when you think about economics, you probably think about some geeky guys in the back room somewhere, like in a place like the World Bank or the UNDP, making these vague policies that nobody understands and sort of telling other people, hey, this is what your economic policy should look like. Right. So basically, if you will, very theoretical folks, probably, folks that you never will see face to face. And that is largely accurate, right? So that is really, if you talk to the average economist, that is what they in fact do. But as a result of that, despite the fact that pretty much every aspect of modern life is driven by economists in one way or the other, most people actually don't know much about what economists do in their day job. Like, what is the job actually? Or what do you do? And this is why, this book, Freakonomics, and Freakonomics is the title of a book, by the way. It's as you can see on the screen. And I'll tell you what's special about this book. So what's special about this book is basically this book, and it's written by two gentlemen, Levitt and Dubner. And by the way, you can see that at some point in time, they actually delivered a talk at Microsoft, and I'm very proud of the fact, right? These people are sort of my little heroes. And they came and delivered a talk at the company that I now work at. So what Freakonomics does is that it explains real world things in terms of economic theory. So it's about taking a day-to-day situation that most lay people, most non-economists would understand, and explaining how an economist would look at that from a theoretical lens. So I'll give you some examples, like why do drug dealers live with their moms? Does the New York City zero tolerance crime policy actually help reduce crime, or was it actually something else like abortion, legalization of abortion that actually helped reduce crime? Does your name, what name your parents give you, does that determine your future, or is it something else that determines your future? These are the sort of questions that the book Freakonomics asks, and it's so lucid because when you read that book, you understand, okay, this is what economists do. Right? This is how they look at the world, and this is the unique insights that these people figure out from every aspect of life. So if you haven't read the book, please do. It's a bestseller, has been a bestseller for a long time. It still continues to be incredibly popular. And basically, this is the book. When I read this book, it was sort of like one of those eureka moments for me, because what happened was I realized that everything that I had been doing at that point in time, and why I was at that point in time, I was actually already involved with the JCP and already involved with Java EE. I understood that, in fact, the reason I was doing all that is driven by very much like what Levitt and Dubner are doing. I was looking at this entire ecosystem from an economist's lens. And so I said, okay, here it is. It's, these guys have written a bestseller book. They're explaining how economists think about things that are sort of outside the realm of economics and could connect with an audience that is not based on economics. So I can do that too. And actually, this is how I developed the material for this talk. So a little bit more of a backstory, but explaining to you what is Freakonomics precisely. So now let's get into sort of the meat of the matter. Standards. That's what this talk is about. It's open standards. And believe it or not, open standards are really everywhere. Every aspect of modern life, unless you live in a cave somewhere or in a very primitive society. Modern life is defined by standards. Every aspect of modern life, there is an open standard in play in one place or the other. It's definitely true of any kind of engineering and technology field. Standards are pretty much everywhere. So the fundamental question you should ask yourself is why is that? Clearly, this is not an accident. There are some important reasons why we have these things like open standards and specifications. And actually, there's quite a few reasons. Not all of these, majority of these majority of the reasons are actually relatively technically based, right? They don't really have much to do with economics per se. There is one important one, and you can see in my screen now, I've listed out the key reasons why open standards, and it's this last one, the maintaining healthy ecosystems part. This is where the economic theory really comes into play, and this is where I'll be spending the rest of the half hour or so talking to you about. But I'll briefly mention the other things. So what are the benefits of standards? One is interoperability. What this means is basically making one thing work with the other. So you can think of USB as a good example of that. It's a USB as a standard. It happens to be a standard now. It's an ISO standard. And because of USB, you can basically plug one thing into the other and make it in an interchangeable fashion. That's one function of standards. Another one is compatibility and portability. So it's similar to interoperability, except for the fact that instead of just being able to plug one thing or the other, whatever the thing is that you're using, that thing itself should also be interchangeable. So a good example of that is, for example, the gas standards, or rather gasoline, petroleum standards that are out there. And this is the reason why you can go into in the United States, or in fact, most of the world, why you can go into a random gas station and make sure that okay, this is the grade of gas I'm getting, and I'm going to put this in my car. And you can go to another gas station and you'll get the same gas. And that's the value of compatibility and portability. That's another value proposition of standards. Reliable baseline quality of service. This is a good example of this is sort of FDA food standards. Okay, so when you say that, okay, I'm going to buy some beef, and you're buying grade A beef, you know what you're getting. So because it is well defined, it doesn't matter what manufacturer you get it from, what supermarket you get it from, as long as you know, okay, this thing fits the standard, you know what the baseline quality of service is. What can you expect from this? A good example, good analog in Jakarta EE actually is the profiles. So what are you getting? Are you getting the core profile? Are you getting the web profile? Or are you getting the full profile? These are three different levels of quality of service. Yet another one is a stable core for a broad ecosystem. When you have a very broad ecosystem, when you have something that is extremely pervasive and used by many different many different parties, and maybe even running the whole world, you need that particular thing to be have a stable core, right? Because otherwise, if the core is unstable, you can't build anything on it if the core itself is unstable and not reliable. So that's yet another function of an open standard and an open specification. This last one, I think most of you understand. It's maximizing vendor and implementation neutrality, meaning minimizing lock-in. So if you buy a product, you shouldn't be locked into this particular vendor. Because of open standards, you can move into another vendor or another implementation if you like, as long as you stick to using only the standard interfaces, or mostly stick to using the standard-based interfaces. So reducing unnecessary fragmentation is another one. This is a little bit more complicated, so I'll sort of skate over it, if you will. But I will talk about it a little bit. Okay, so this does have a corollary in terms of economic theory. Basically, you really have when you have a situation that I'll talk to you in a moment, it's called the network effect. There's really only two options. One is hyper competition, and the other one is open standards. So when you have hyper competition, it causes a lot of unnecessary churn and fragmentation. And this causes a problem of not having a stable core for a broad ecosystem. So this one, again, I'll sort of explain this one and move on. And finally, maintaining healthy competitive ecosystems. So this is the one we'll be focusing on. We're talking about why open standards are so key to maintaining these healthy competitive ecosystems. So I'll pause a little bit and it'll give you an opportunity to take a look at the questions. I see one posted. For developing mobile and applications on iPhone and Android, which framework can be used? With all due respect, I'm going to defer this question until the end. If there's time for it, I will answer this question. I don't think it's actually that relevant to this talk, to be honest. But I will answer the question later on. Okay, so first thing you should ask yourself is like, why? Do economists actually care about this stuff, right? And some people are genuinely surprised that all of this open standard stuff is actually based on economic theory, pretty sound economic theory. In fact, that is very much true, right? So if you take a look at any of the standards organizations, IEEE, ISO, I hope even to some extent, the more technical things like OASIS, they will actually almost always base their core values and their charter on, believe it or not, economic theory. Literally, it'll be something that is written by an economist. And I'll give you, I gave you some examples of that. It happens to be from the ISO and IEEE, because those are pretty big standards-based organizations. So actually, what I'll be explaining to you is a very small microcosm in terms of where open standards and economic analysis intersects. Namely, I'll really be talking to you about one single economic theory that applies to open standards. There's actually many, many more. So I'll give you a few examples of that for those of you who are curious to find out more. So now we're really getting into the meat of the matter. So this is make or break slide, okay? So if you don't understand what this slide is, you won't understand the rest of this talk. So I better deliver on this slide. But if you understand what this slide is telling you, really you will understand the majority of the rest of what I have to talk to you about in the remainder of the 35 minutes or so. So this economic theory is called the network effect. Okay, and I'll explain to you what the network effect is. So let's imagine there's 3 different networks. As you can see in my screen, there's 3 different phone networks. And believe it or not, actually, a lot of this came from telecommunications. I'll explain that in a moment as well. But 3 different phone networks. Okay, so imagine yourself, the phones were just a relatively recent invention. So there's 3 different choices that have evolved over time. One is, you're a really smart guy and you have your brother-in-law who's also very, very smart. They're both engineers, and you see this new technology called telephones, and you install a telephone line between his house and yours. Okay, so it's a relatively simple network. You pick up your phone and then it auto dials to your brother-in-law, and he gets a dial. He picks up and then you're connected. You guys can talk. And it's only a network that connects 2 houses. Now, let's see that things have evolved a little bit more, and now instead of this one phone network, you also have another option where you decide as a community. Let's say you live in a housing development, and you all decide, hey, let's have our own phone network that connects our entire neighborhood of, in this case, let's say 5 houses, and each of these houses, has a specific number assigned to it. So you pick up the phone this time, and instead of auto dialing, you have to dial a number between 1 and 5, and it'll connect you to the house that you want to connect to. And it's all free, pretty much all free. Like your brother-in-law network is free. This next one is almost free. You pay a little bit of cost to maintain this little network, and that's about it. And then you have finally this other network, and this is managed by a much bigger company. Okay, and a much bigger company that perhaps spans your entire town, entire city, or maybe even your country, or even the whole world. Okay, and this is our modern phone network, if you will. You pick it up and you dial whatever number you want. You dial your country code, and you're connected to whoever it is that you're wanting to connect to. And this is exponentially more expensive. Okay, so it has a let's say you're paying let's say a modern. This is a brand new novelty, and you have to pay $100. $100 a month or $100 a year, let's say, and you're going to connect to this network. Now, you being a logical person, which one are you probably most likely going to choose? Even though your brother-in-law network is free and your neighborhood network is pretty much free, and this other thing is much more expensive, and you don't have much control over it, you do have quality of service, most likely you're going to pick the larger network. Why are you going to do that? The phone is the same, the line is the same, the service is basically, technologically speaking, the service is basically the same. What is the difference? The difference really is how many other people are using the network. Okay, so the value of this network is actually how many points of connectivity, how much usage it is. So this is called the network effect, right? So this is always going to hold true. The network effect is that the larger the network, the greater the value of using that particular option. In terms of, and this plays out, the network effect, believe it or not, in technology is extremely strong. Oftentimes, we will make technology choices not based on the merits of the technology or features or even price in many cases. We will be making technology choices based on how many other people are using this particular thing. Often that is the overriding factor. And what is in play here is a network effect. Now, there are some good reasons why the network effect is in play, right? So it probably is a better quality network in some way, it could be. But fundamentally, you're deriving greater value. The value of the thing itself, a part of the value of the thing you are using is actually how many other people are using it. So this is a network effect. All right, so when you have this network effect in place, okay, when it's the case that whatever the technical merits of something may be, actually you're making the choice to use it based on how many other people are using it. When this is true, really you're going to have two different market outcomes. That's it, right? There's no other long-term, there may be some intermediate states, but fundamentally in the end, you will wind up in two different destinations and only two destinations. And these two are, you will either end up with an open standard, or you will wind up with what is known as a de facto standard. That's the only choices, because that's where the network effect is going to drive the market, drive behavior of most of the consumers. So you might think, okay, both of these things have the word standard in them. How different can they be? They're probably basically the same thing, right? As long as it's some kind of standard, I'm good. In reality, this is not really the case. All right, so the reason this is not the case is because these have fundamentally very different characteristics, right? They're not similar in any way. So instead of me trying to explain this to you, I actually took a screenshot from another individual that basically gave a workshop on this very topic, and I basically screenshotted that individual's slide, and this is the slide that is there. So a de jure standard or an open standard is something that is established by a formal body of some kind. Okay, so it is by fiat. It is created specifically. It is purposely created to be an open standard. It's a thing that is very purposeful. A de facto standard is not that. A de facto standard basically is a market reality more than anything else. So basically, a de facto standard says, I won, essentially. I won the competition. I own the market. If you played that game Monopoly, basically you're the winner or the near winner of the Monopoly. You essentially control the market for all intents and purposes. That is what a de facto standard is. So these are very, very different. In fact, they're diametrically opposite. So for a de facto standard, it reflects the market situation. It provides some benefits of standardization. It maximizes the network effect, but it is effectively a monopoly. It also lacks transparency, which means that you don't get to really determine how this de facto standard is going to behave, because it is not open. It's not necessarily open. It is basically determined by whoever is in control of that de facto standard. And it will typically limit information. You won't know why a particular decision is made around this de facto standard. A de jure standard is the diametric opposite again. So this ensures transparency, and transparency is not a sort of accidental characteristic. It is a built-in characteristic of an open standard. It's always going to be consensus driven. There's going to be well-defined stakeholders. There's no accidental stakeholders. People will purposely opt into being a stakeholder into an open standard. Typically, the problems are it takes a little bit longer because frankly, democracies are messy, right? Dictatorships are simple when it comes down to decision making, and it takes time. It takes time. It's messy, and then you finally, there's a lot of give and take before you get to a particular outcome. There is always a risk of somebody essentially hijacking an open standard and sort of defeating the entire open standard ecosystem and creating a de facto standard instead. These are the risks. So they're very, very much not the same whatsoever. So here's some examples of real life standards. And the one in the middle is actually AT&T. And believe it or not, AT&T is the economic theory of the network effect and how it relates to monopolies actually came from AT&T. So the US government actually observed that AT&T has a network effect. And as a result, it has a monopoly. And that is, at least at the time, thankfully, was seen as something very bad for the country. So what they did was they decided to force AT&T to break up into smaller entities. And that's how you actually have even telecommunications companies today. Otherwise, there would be just AT&T probably controlling the entire planet as one phone network. Some other examples, very similar thing is Standard Oil Company, again, broken up for the very same reasons. US Steel, yet another case of sort of the government stepping in and saying, okay, this is a monopoly. They have a network effect situation going on. We need to do something about this. Okay. So in case now, some of you probably intuitively know, oh, monopolies are bad. We should work against monopolies and so on and so forth. But do you really understand why monopolies are bad? Now, the reason I said monopoly power is for those of you who are not economists, when I say monopoly, somehow a lot of people take that to mean that it must be like a total control of one company, and that is the only thing that what monopoly means. So how can there be a monopoly if there's any other company, more than only one company? That's actually not true, because it's not about that. In fact, you can say that the United States is a de facto monopoly superpower. Although there are many other countries, the reality is when you have monopoly power, that's a different thing from monopoly. So you do not necessarily need only one company. You just need an entity that has a dominant control over a given market. That's what monopoly power actually means. So it's different from just having one company. So the downsides of having monopoly power, and hopefully you will pay attention to this because there are some ramifications currently going on where what I'm about to tell you is actually relevant. So one obvious one is higher long-term pricing or predatory pricing. So higher long-term pricing really doesn't mean necessarily monetary price, although in most cases it does entail monetary price. In all those other examples that I gave you, there's very clear indication that that is what was actually happening. But long-term pricing actually just means sort of what is the cost that you pay in order to use the thing, and that will actually can increase over time when you have monopoly power. Fundamentally because of the next line, which is what ends up happening when you truly do have monopoly power is that you have lower and lower quality of service. And although you have a lower quality of service, you don't have any options because of the network effect. Even if something is kind of crappy, you're still using it because everybody else is using it. And lower levels of long-term innovation. When there's no competition, there's no incentive to innovate, you won't effectively innovate. In terms of a consumer, you have fewer market choices. In terms of anybody that's wanting to enter the market, you have very high entry barriers. However good your company may be, or however sort of diligent of an engineer you may be, it doesn't matter. Because now in order to enter this market, you really need some significant competitive advantage before you can even consider entering this market. And of course, the monopoly people that hold monopoly power, companies that hold monopoly power, whether they do it intentionally or unintentionally, almost always will have anti-competitive behaviors. They will try to keep people out, essentially, and use their monopoly power to unduly disadvantage a competitor. And finally, it's a high-risk monoculture ecosystem, and that has to do with the previous point that I made for you, is that when you have something that a lot of people depend upon, that thing needs to be very rock solid and dependable. So when you have at the heart of an ecosystem something that itself is determined by, whose fate is determined by a very small amount of people, that thing can collapse very quickly. And what happens is the entire ecosystem collapses with it. A good example of this is the USSR and basically the Warsaw Pact countries that were around the USSR. So these countries were so heavily dependent economically, specifically, economically and culturally on the USSR, that the moment that the USSR collapsed, all of their economies collapsed with it. Okay, that is not going to be the case in, for example, an open market economy, even though NATO, you can say, is dominated by the United States. Even if the United States economy actually collapsed, thankfully that'll never happen, but if it did, it wouldn't matter, because in reality, this particular market works differently. There's a lot more checks and balances and a lot of more local autonomy and redundancy, so that it actually doesn't matter. So it's not actually a monoculture ecosystem. But the main point here is that when you do have network effects, you will have a core of some kind, and you need that core to be pretty stable. Okay, so let's talk about how, and there's about 10 minutes left. I don't see any questions yet. If you have other questions, please, I'll remind you to post them. So let's think about how do open standards work. We've been talking about open standards, but foundationally, how does it work? It's important to understand that, to understand the differentiator between this and a de facto standard. So this is how an open standard works. This is the core elements of it. You have a process, and this process needs to be very, very well defined. This is where the transparency comes from. This is where the openness comes from. And you have multiple parties, multiple stakeholders that can contribute to the process, contribute to the open process. And this could be literally really anybody that wants to. Okay, so it could be just a single individual. And by the way, I was an individual contributor into the JCP for many years, so I was that guy that you see there. It could be obviously corporations, right? And there's plenty of examples of that. Certainly, in terms of Jakarta EE, IBM, Red Hat, Oracle, Microsoft, these are all big companies that are contributing into the process. But it could also be groups of individuals. Okay, and groups of individuals are a very important counterbalance. If there's a moment, I'll explain to you why that is. You really do need all these three things in place, or at least you need, maybe not the individual, but you need those groups of people and you need the companies in order for this to actually work. And finally, in this process, there will be some product, something that is basically the open specification, and that part and parcel of the deal here is that anybody in the world can use it. So the ultimate product, the process itself is going to be open and transparent, and the thing that is produced is also going to be open and available to anyone. These are the key things of what is characteristic of a true open standard. So what do I mean by that? I won't go into the details of it, but basically it looks something like this. And by the way, this is just nothing much more than the Jakarta EE's actual specification process. And I won't go, there's no need for me to go into the details of explaining each of these things, but basically the main thing you need to take away here is that there is a process. It is iterative, it is well-defined. Each step is well understood, and often there will be a consensus step. So all of these review steps that you see here, this is where the consensus building takes place. This is where all the stakeholders come together and agree that, okay, yeah, we all agree that we can move on to the next step. So this is how the checks and balances and how the openness and the consensus building, consensus-driven process takes place here. So in terms of specifications, this is in terms of what is actually produced. I talked about the process. Let's talk about what is actually produced. These are the things that are typically produced. So first and foremost is the specification documents exists for Jakarta EE. Right? You can read the spec for every single thing. When you read it, when you say read a spec, it's really that specification document. But there's three different things. It's interesting pattern. It comes in threes. I think there's a reason for that. But it would make an interesting evolutionary study. But it comes in threes. The other piece is compatibility test kit. So this is where you say, okay, you have implemented the standard. How do you actually verify that? Right? How do you independently verify that, yes, you in fact have implemented the standard? And that is what the compatibility test kit, or TCK, typically what is known as, is there for. Then there's going to be one or more compatible implementations. There needs to be at least one. But typically, hopefully, there'll be many different compatible implementations. Now, in some cases, there can be something called a reference implementation, and this used to be the case in the JCP. It is not in Jakarta EE. And this is basically a uniquely identified implementation whose basic purpose is really nothing much more than telling other implementers how is this thing supposed to work. It's an example, if you will. Right? So you have the theory in terms of the document, you have the test in terms of the TCK, but then you have actually an example of how to implement the thing. Now, one of the things that I will warn you about is there can also be partial implementations. And this is the difference between something that passes a TCK and something that does not and claims to pass a TCK. It's a very dangerous thing in terms of open standards. So caveat emptor, or buyer beware. Okay, so if you really do value open standards, make sure the thing you're using actually is TCK compliant, not just claiming to be compliant. Okay. And then finally, you have the last triad that is foundation of all this. It's really the people in some ways. And that is governance. So in other words, who makes sure all this is actually functioning properly? In case of Jakarta EE, that's the Eclipse Foundation. There are stakeholders, and that would be basically anybody that actually has a say in the matter of how this process and artifacts are produced. Typically, Microsoft is a stakeholder, IBM is a stakeholder, any independent members of the Jakarta EE working groups, those are stakeholders. And then there's community. There's people, all the people that are using the thing or observing the thing or contributing to the thing in some way or the other. And actually, you need all three of these things in order to make an effective open standard. Okay. So I have about 5 minutes. I'm going to skip over a little bit. I don't see any questions, so that's a good sign. Now, some people will argue that you don't need open standards anymore because you have open source. Not true. Open standards and open source are similar. Again, they have some semantic similarity. They have the word open in them, but in reality, they do not serve the same function. What open source gives you is it gives you transparency. And it gives you some level of control over, if you're really unhappy with something, you can fork it, provided under the license terms of the open source project that you're talking about. But it does not guarantee those other things that we talked about. It does not guarantee interoperability at all. It does not guarantee vendor neutral, all of those characteristics that we talked about earlier. Open standards do not guarantee any of these things. You may accidentally have those things, but you will actually not, they're not in no way guaranteed. In fact, with open source, you are almost guaranteed to have incompatibility because each fork is going to be incompatible with each other. When you actually take a objective look at our industry, in reality, what actually happens is truly successful things are both open standards and open source. Okay, so these are some examples of what these things are. And you'll notice that they are all both open standards and open source. That's what maximizes openness, right? So you actually want both. I'm going to skip this part over. There are various complaints about open standards. They all have counterpoints. Okay, the reality is that life is just not perfect. These criticisms that people have often open standards, they're bad faith criticisms. A majority of the time, and you can see why they're sort of bad faith arguments, because they're arguing that something should be perfect, and nothing in life is perfect. So there are always counter arguments, a counter side to what these typical arguments that people have with open standards. I'll share the link to this deck. It's already available in my speaker deck. You can take a look at it. I think it's relatively self-explanatory. What I mean by, it's not as black and white as that. I have a question here. Any Java recommended framework for developing mobile applications? Again, I'm gonna explain this later if there's time. It's not really super relevant to this. I'm not here to deliver a talk on mobile development. Okay, so the main thing here is, remember I talked about that important bit of stakeholders, right? And one of the key stakeholders are the community, all right? And the community really plays a key part in making things, if things are not perfect, if there are things that could be improved, it's really the community that is that external third-party force that ensures that things are actually improving. And this is where you all step in. You do not need to be a stakeholder. You do not need to be part of the governance. You actually need to be just somebody that is looking at things and basically saying, hey, this is not quite right. And let's say what's not quite right. And even better yet, step in and fix it. Okay, fix whatever it is that is not right. So I'm going to skip over this slide. Basically, ultimately, what the punchline is, hey, this is why you want to use Jakarta EE. But more importantly, this is why you want to consider being an ambassador, is because it's that third part of that triad. It's the community part. It's that external, for lack of a better word, watchdog function that ensures that things are in fact are healthy, and actually putting in those independent contributions to make sure things are actually better. Okay. Now, lastly, in this last minute here, I do not actually have a resources slide for here, because much of this I actually shared with you earlier. And if I try to share with you, I'd have to be sharing literally many very boring economics books, so I'm not going to do that. But what I do want to talk to you a little bit about is, I'm also not here to be an open source pastor. I'm just not that type. So I want to inject some balance into all of this as well. So everything that I told you, it's the truth. There's some element of truth in all of that. There's some element of value in all of that. But don't take it as religion, okay? Because these are theories, economic theories, and they have nuances. So these are some of these nuances that I'll talk to you about, and this is where I'll finish the talk today. So please do understand that not everything can be standardized. A few years ago, when I started in the J2EE world, one of the big problems was people sort of took standards as binary. So everything is either standard or it's not. The reality is that that cannot be. There's always going to be things that are outside of standard that extend the frontiers. That's where the innovation comes from. That expand the frontiers of what an open standard is, right? And ultimately, some of those changes are hopefully rolled back into an open standard. And also, standards are not foolproof. Okay, so I already talked about one thing that is needed, and that is, a healthy community, healthy set of stakeholders, a strong governance body to make all of this work. Because while standards do help in preventing monopoly power, it does not guarantee. It is also not an absolute guarantee that you will not wind up with a monopoly-like situation. In particular, there's one thing that open standards do not protect against, and that's something called oligarchy, which is where it's not a monopoly, but the set of stakeholders is so small it might as well be. So this is yet another thing to guard against and to make sure that does not happen. And there is actually, while everybody is standards compliant, they actually have sufficient internal competition within them to drive the things forward and to continue innovating. And finally, there's always about peaceful coexistence. Just because I'm talking about open standards here does not necessarily mean that open standards is the only answer in a given ecosystem. In fact, one of the key functions of an open standard should be that it fosters an ecosystem like that is built around it. And this is, again, where this concept of profiles comes in as well to some extent, right? So there can always be peaceful coexistence. There can be things that are not quite standards compliant or use bits and pieces of the standard And maybe even, okay, I can live with partial implementations. But the key part is the open standard actually still needs to be central to this entire ecosystem. If that's not the case, then we are in trouble. So we just need to make sure that doesn't happen. But beyond that, we should also not take a position that says, okay, it's open standards and nothing else. So ultimately, it's really all up to you. Just like it is for any, let's say, democratic system, ultimately, none of this will work without your participation. So if there's one thing that I urge you to take away from this is think about why these things matter and why these things matter to your career, perhaps. Why maintaining a healthy competitive ecosystem is important to you, and what is it that you need to do in order to make sure that that is in fact the case. Okay, so last question, and I'm actually out of time. I had many arguments in my job, Swing versus Java EE, and the problem was often that Java EE took a long time to deliver sometime new, and people said, I don't care about standard, I use what others use and what is available. So I often lost about trying to defend Java EE. Hopefully with Jakarta EE now it will get better. Please wrap it up. Okay, I'm wrapping it up. Good point, right? And again, my answer would be, hey, if it's not perfect, join and make sure that the velocity is correct. That is part of the reasons why we moved the thing from the JCP into Jakarta EE. If the velocity is not good enough, if the features are not there, make some noise, right? Or better yet, fix it. All right, thank you very much. Have a good evening, afternoon, wherever you may be, or super early morning, if that's the case for you. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.